Operation Battleaxe was a British Army operation during the Second World War in June 1941, to clear eastern Cyrenaica of German and Italian forces and raise the Siege of Tobruk. It was the first time during the war that a significant German force fought on the defensive, but the operation failed as British forces attacked strong defensive positions created by German General Erwin Rommel. The British lost over half of the tanks on the first day and only one of the 3 attacks succeeded. The British achieved mixed results on the second day, being pushed back on the western flank and repulsing a big German counter-attack in the centre. On the third day, the British narrowly avoided disaster by withdrawing just ahead of a German encircling movement. The failure of Battleaxe led to the replacement of British General Sir Archibald Wavell, Commander-in-Chief Middle East, by Claude Affleck. Wavell took Affleck's position as Commander-in-Chief, India. Background: Operation Sonnenblume in late March 1941, soon after the arrival of the Afrika Korps in Tripoli, Libya to reinforce the Italians, the Axis forces quickly captured the British frontline position at El Agheila and by mid-April had reached as far as Salem, Egypt. The British held the fortified port of Tobruk, which was besieged by the Axis. Having been informed by General Wavell that the Western Desert Force was vastly inferior to the Axis forces now in Africa, Churchill ordered that a convoy of tanks and Hawker Hurricanes, convoy WS-58, be sailed through the Mediterranean instead of around the Cape of Good Hope to cut 40 days off the journey. Tobruk. The German Armed Forces High Command sent General Friedrich Paulus to Africa to investigate the situation. On the 12th of May, General Paulus, after witnessing one of Rommel's failed attempts to assault Tobruk, sent a report to OKW describing Rommel's position as weak, with critical shortages of both fuel and ammunition. With Operation Barbarossa imminent, Field Marshal Walther von Brauchitsch, Commander-in-Chief of the German Army, ordered Rommel not to advance further or attack Tobruk again. Operation Brevity through ultra-intercepts. The British also received Paulus a report, and Churchill, believing that one strong push would dislodge German forces, began to increase the pressure on General Wavell to attack. Wavell quickly prepared Operation Brevity, a limited operation with the intention of seizing Sollum, the Halfaya Pass and Fort Capuzzo, then continuing to advance on to Sidi Aziz and towards Tobruk as far as supply would allow. While not risking the forces committed, its objective was to destroy as much Axis equipment as possible and secure a foothold for the larger Operation Battleaxe to be launched from once the new tanks were made available. Brevity began on the 15th of May and Fort Capuzzo and Halfaya Pass were captured, but next day William Gott, concerned that his 22nd Guards Brigade would be wiped out if caught in the open should the Germans attack with tanks, decided to pull almost the entire force back to Halfaya Pass, and the operation officially ended on the 17th of May, with only the Halfaya Pass captured. The pass was retaken by a small German force on the 27th of May in Operation Scorpion. Greece and Crete. By the end of May, the Greek island of Crete had fallen to the Germans. This meant that the German Air Force would have additional airfields available to threaten Allied shipping and also to protect their own supply. Convoys and troops in Cyrenaica. Delaying Battleaxe could therefore mean facing stronger Axis opposition. To offset this, the British Chiefs of Staff stated that it was imperative that control be wrested in the area between Sollum and Derna and British Air Forces in that region be re-established. Prelude. Tiger Convoy. On the 12th of May, the Tiger Convoy arrived in Alexandria with 238 tanks and 43 Hurricanes, 21 times light tank Mk, 82 times cruiser tanks and 135 times infantry tanks. There were delays in unloading the tanks, which also had to be adapted for desert use. Battleaxe was postponed until the 10th of June. The tanks were intended for the 7th Armored Division, which had been out of action since February, after most of its tanks had worn out during Operation Compass. British plan of attack. On the 28th of May, Wavell gave his orders for Operation Battleaxe, an operation in 3 stages. The Axis forces were to be defeated on the frontier in the area of Hafire. Sollum, Capuzzo and Sidi Aziz was to be secured. In the second phase, 13th Corps was to secure the area around Tobruk and El Adam, then the areas of Derna and Mekelle were to be captured. The plan was based on intelligence information, which incorrectly indicated that 2/3 of the German tank strength was at Tobruk, which would put the British at a decisive material advantage on the frontier. The attack was scheduled for the 7th of June but was pushed back at the instance of General Omar Cray, whose squadrons had not received the tanks until the 9th of June. The new date was the 15th of June, giving Cray 5 days for additional training. In the first stage, the British would advance in a 3-prong assault to clear the frontier region. Along the coast was Coast Force and inland was Escarpment Force. The former was responsible for capturing Hafire Pass, while the latter was to capture the remainder of the frontier at Fort Capuzzo. Mused and Sollum, the 7th Armored Brigade Group and the artillery of the support group, were to engage and destroy the German tanks, which were thought to be at Hafod Ridge. This would also trap Axis units on the frontier between themselves and the remainder of the British forces. After capturing the frontier, the brigades of the 7th Armored Division would reform and continue north to relieve Tobruk. Once joined by the Tobruk garrison, the combined forces would press on to the west, driving the Germans as far back as possible. 3 days prior to the start of Battleaxe, to help soften the Axis forces, the Royal Air Force was to bomb Benghazi, while all aircraft capable of ground attack were to bomb Axis movement on the frontier. Once the battle began, fighters were to patrol defensively over Allied ground forces, while medium bombers were to stand by to engage Axis columns. Such was the priority on Battleaxe, that Arthur Tedder was instructed by the Chiefs of Staff to accept significant risks in other theaters by diverting all possible air support for it. Beresford Peace and Tedder established headquarters well to the rear at Sidi Barrani and Martin Baghush. Beresford Peace chose Sidi Barrani as, even though it was more than a 5-hour drive from the battlefield, it was equipped with the most advanced airfield for reconnaissance aircraft and was also the most forward position from which communications could be maintained with Martin Baghush. Axis preparations, though brevity had failed to yield any territory to the British, it showed Rommel that his frontline defences were quite easy to breach. Anticipating further British attacks, the Axis forces created a line of fortified positions from Hafire to Sidi Aziz, placing a number of anti-tank guns and anti-tank mines on the Hafire Pass, point 206 and on point 208. The primary responsibility of the frontier defense was charged to the 15th Panzer Division, which had received a new commander, General Walter Newman Silkoff, on the 8th of June. Poor signals security in the 7th Armored Division gave Rommel 9 hours notice of the operation. Rommel sent the 5th Light Division to the south of Tobruk, ready to use it against either the Somme area or on Tobruk, and ordered a big artillery bombardment of Tobruk the night before the operation, to prevent the Allied garrison from breaking out. Unfortunately, our petrol stocks were badly depleted, and it was with some anxiety that we contemplated the coming British attack, for we knew that our moves would be decided more by the petrol gauge than by tactical requirements. Battle. The 15th of June for the RAF. Everything went according to plan on the first day. Axis supply columns and airfields had been hit repeatedly up to the start of the attack, and once the operation began, British columns were able to move unmolested from the starting points at Sofa and Buq to the destinations covered by RAF fighters. Axis aircraft managed only 6 attacks the day. On the eastern side, at 5:15, Coast Force, commanded by Brigadier Reginald Savory and charged with capturing Half-Hour Pass, started to move on to their objective. On the escarpment was the Half-Hour Group, composed of the 2nd Battalion Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders, the 13 tanks of the 4th Royal Tank Regiment C Squadron, and an artillery battery from the 31st Field Regiment. To their east and below the lip of the escarpment were the 1st Battalion 6th Rajputana Rifles and 2nd Battalion 5th Maratha Light Infantry, 2 troops of the 4th Royal Tank Regiment A Squadron, and a few 25-pounder guns. At 5:40, British artillery for the Half-Hour Group was scheduled to open fire on the German and Italian forces stationed in Half-Hour to provide cover for the tanks and infantry, but the battery had become bogged down by soft sand. After waiting until 6 o'clock, 15 minutes after the fighting began to the west below the escarpment, the commander of C Squadron ordered his tanks to attack at the top of the pass. Soon after, though, the anti-tank guns of the German and Italian defenders opened fire, and within a few hours all but one light tank and one of the Matildas had been destroyed, including Miles' own. The Cameron Highlanders initially continued their advance but were soon driven back by a detachment of German armoured cars and motorised infantry. The British forces below the escarpment did not fare much better, as 4 of the Matildas were disabled by anti-tank mines which were supposed to have been cleared. This blocked the path of the remaining 2 and reduced the small tank force to acting in a pillbox capacity. The Rajputana Rifles and Marathas made several attempts to reach the pass, but were repelled each time. The former lost the commanding officer in the final attack. At the central thrust, the 7th Royal Tank Regiment had reached Fort Capuzzo by noon and scattered the defenders, who retreated north to join the 15th Panzer Division, which lay between them and Bardia. Soon after, however, they faced several counter-attacks by a battalion from the 8th Panzer Regiment of the 15th Panzer Division. After being joined by the 22nd Guards Brigade, they faced the final and largest counter-attack at 1830, but managed to repulse it. These were, in actuality, not serious assaults, as Rommel would not commit the 15th Panzer Division to battle without having additional information on the situation. Instead, the 8th Panzer Regiment's primary tactic was to skirmish briefly and then feign a disordered route to lure Matilda tanks into a chase which led them directly into concealed anti-tank guns. Neither side took much damage from these actions. In response to the British capture of Capuzzo, and concerned with a possible attack on Somme and Bardia, Rommel ordered the 5th Light Division to cede Azaz in preparation for a possible counter-attack. With the exception of the units which had been detached to support the attack on Half-Hour, the 4th Royal Tank Regiment had been used as a flank guard for the 7th Royal Tank Regiment, while Squadron B was kept in reserve. The 3 remaining troops of Squadron A had initial success against Battle Position 38, capturing 200 Axis prisoners and 8 field guns with virtually no loss. These gains were lost when Squadron A were repelled at point 206 and German forces counter-attacked at B.P.38. In the evening, after Squadron A had been whittled down to only one remaining tank, the 16 tanks of Squadron B were brought into action and point 206 was captured. In capturing these objectives, the British also took over 500 German and Italian prisoners. That night, the 2nd Scots Guards, a battalion of the 22nd Guards Brigade, were able to advance further eastward and additionally capture an outpost at Musset. On the western side, the 7th Armoured Brigade had placed the 2nd Royal Tank Regiment, equipped with older Cruiser tanks, in front of the 6th Royal Tank Regiment so that the new Crusader tanks of the latter could be used as a surprise weapon. The force reached Hafford Ridge by about 9 o'clock. After 2nd Royal Tank Regiment had crossed over the first ridge, they were attacked at near point-blank range by dug-in anti-tank guns, destroying 2 A9 Cruiser tanks before the rest could retreat. This development posed a serious problem for the brigade, as the Cruiser tanks were armed with 2-pounder anti-tank guns which lacked the high explosive rounds needed to effectively engage infantry and artillery. Supporting artillery was not immediately accessible either, as it was attached to the support group in the southwest which was covering the 7th Armoured Brigade's flank. Since a frontal attack was impractical, it was decided to attempt a flanking attack while waiting for the artillery to arrive. A small force of tanks from the 2nd Royal Tank Regiment was sent to the western part of the Hafford Ridge with orders to turn into the First Valley. The attack went well at first, as the tanks caught the Axis forces unaware and were able to strafe along the trenches with their machine guns, losing only one tank in the process. As they approached point 208 on the way eastward though, the commander became aware of its fortifications and ordered his units to disengage due to an equipment shortage. Only one tank per troop was equipped with a radio and 5 of his tanks, not receiving the order, continued towards point 208 and were destroyed by its 88mm guns. Soon, reports came in from Allied aircraft that German tanks were approaching and the order was given to clear the ridges to utilize its advantageous terrain for the upcoming tank battle. At 17:30 reports came in from the forward observers that the defenses were withdrawing from Hafford Ridge. This seemed like the ideal time to strike, so the order was given for Squadron B of the 6th Royal Tank Regiment to attack. After clearing the first ridge, it looked as though the reports were accurate, as German trucks and towed guns were seen moving away over the second crest. Pursuit began, but upon the British forces clearing the second ridge, the Axis forces sprung the trap and fired on the Crusader tanks at near point-blank range with waiting guns. Within minutes, 11 of the Crusaders were destroyed and 6 more heavily damaged. The Axis infantry and anti-tank guns, bereft of entrenchments, also took significant casualties. Over 30 German tanks from a battalion of the 5th Panzer Regiment, part of the 5th Light Division which had earlier been stationed north at Sidi Azaz, were seen arriving from the west. As it was starting to grow dark, neither side closed with the other and the 7th Armoured Brigade slowly withdrew during long-range fighting. By the end of the first day, Fort Capuzzo had been captured and Halfire Pass and Hafford Ridge remained in Axis possession. During the attacks, the British had lost a significant number of tanks. In the 7th Armoured Brigade, the 2nd Royal Tank Regiment was down to 28 Cruiser tanks and the 6th Royal Tank Regiment to only 20 of the 50 Crusaders. Many of the tanks which had been disabled but were repairable, were abandoned in the field as the 7th Armoured Brigade withdrew from Hafford Ridge, leaving them for seizure by German tank recovery teams. The 4th Armoured Brigade, from its original strength of roughly 100 Matildas, was down to 37. German panzer losses were mostly insignificant, though there had been many casualties among the garrisons at Hafford Ridge, Point 206 and Fort Capuzzo. Beresford Peace planned to have the 11th Infantry Brigade continue its attack next day on Half-Hour Pass, the 22nd Guards Brigade to hold their position, and from the 4th Armoured Brigade to reinforce the 7th Armoured Brigade for a combined attack on the outnumbered 5th Light Division. Through the Intelligence Interception Service, Rommel had a fairly clear picture of the British situation, including the losses, problems and the new orders issued by Beresford Peace. Rommel was concerned for the forces at Half-Hour Pass, which were trapped by the 22nd Guards Brigade on one side and the 11th Infantry Brigade on the other, and running low on supplies. His plan was to have the 5th Light Division, which by midnight had almost fully reached Sidi Aziz, drive south towards Sidi Omar and then east towards Sidi Suleiman and then northeast to Half-Hour Pass, approaching the 11th Infantry Brigade from the rear, to prevent the redeployment of Matildas, either to reinforce the 7th Armoured Brigade as Beresford Peace planned, or to assist the British forces at Half-Hour. Newman Silkoff was ordered to attack Capuzzo. He ordered the attacks to begin while still dark, as the British intended to start their operations shortly after dawn. The 16th of June, the 11th Infantry Brigade renewed their attack on Half-Hour Pass, but met with the same failure as the day prior. Bark's forces, though outnumbered and running low on supplies, were now totally surrounded, and thus could not retreat even if they were inclined to do so. Massavi saw this lack of progress and disregarded Beresford Peace's orders to release his tanks and decided to retain the few remaining Matildas. He had until some breach of the Axis defences could be made. Newman Silkoff began his attack on British-held Fort Capuzzo at 6 o'clock. He organized the 80 tanks under his command into two columns and attacked Capuzzo from either side. The attack went poorly from the onset, as the 15th Panzer Division ran directly into heavy artillery from 25-pounders which had been brought up during the night and matted the tanks in entrenched positions. By 10 o'clock, the 15th Panzer Division had lost 50 of its tanks, and by 12 o'clock, they were forced to withdraw. Soon after the German forces withdrew, the Scots Guards advanced further west, capturing the Solemn Barracks to prevent Axis forces from either flanking on the east or linking up with the Half-Hour garrison. Starting at dawn, the 5th Light Division began to advance southwards past the western edge of Hafford Ridge. The 7th Armoured Brigade kept pace with them to the east, joined by the 7th Support Group as the two forces approached Sidi Omar. During the running skirmish, the British tanks had a few successful attacks against unarmoured German transport vehicles, but they found themselves at a significant disadvantage when they engaged the Panzers, who utilized an extremely effective tactic against them. The Panzer IVs, armed with high-explosive 75mm guns with an effective range of till 2,750 meters, would open fire while still well out of the roughly 460 meters range of the 2-pounder guns found on British tanks. While this would do minimal damage to the British tanks, it decimated the towed 25-pounder artillery, which would be forced to withdraw, without British artillery to concern them. The Panzer IV and 50mm gun-armed Panzer IIIs could then safely close range with the British counterparts and pick off the thinly armed Kreuzer tanks while still remaining beyond the range of the British tank guns. If the British tanks attempted to move forward to engage the Panzers, the latter would quickly retreat behind a pre-established screen of anti-tank guns, while lighter armoured elements would begin to move around the British flanks. To make matters worse for the 7th Armoured Brigade, they had problems with the reliability of the tanks and suffered numerous breakdowns. By evening, both regiments of the 7th Armoured Brigade had retreated east of the frontier wire and the 7th Support Group and withdrawn even further. At 1900, just as dusk fell, the 5th Light Division further weakened the 7th Armoured Brigade with a strong attack which only ended due to the onset of complete darkness. Rommel, who had seen several of the engagements between the 7th Armoured Brigade and 5th Light Division, decided to attempt a full thrust against the 7th Armoured Brigade. At 1600, he ordered the 15th Panzer Division to leave only minimal elements at its position north of Fort Capuzzo and make all haste to the northern flank of the 5th Light Division, which was pressing eastward to Sidi Suleiman. He hoped to cut off the majority of the British forces, encircling and then eliminating them. During the afternoon, Wavell had flown to Beresford-Peace to simplify the making of decisions. When he arrived, Beresford-Peace was away, meeting with Messervy and Cray, where he reconfirmed his orders for the infantry to maintain its attack on Halfire and hold Capuzzo, while the 4th Armoured Brigade was to join the 7th Armoured Brigade to confront the 5th Light Division to the west. At night, on learning of the 5th Light Division advance, Messervy took the initiative and ordered his forces to withdraw and ordered the remaining Matildas of the 4th Armoured Brigade to form a screen to protect the retreating infantry from the advance of the Panzers to the west. The 7th Armoured Brigade had lost more than half of the Kreuzer tanks operational in the morning and was down to 21 runners. The 4th Armoured Brigade had been reduced to 17 Matildas. The 17th of June at 4:30, Rommel's panzers began their advance. The 5th Light Division encountered the 7th Armoured Brigade at 6 o'clock and began pushing them back. By 8 o'clock that morning, they had reached Sidi Suleiman. At Capuzzo, the early morning movements of the 15th Panzer Division led Messervy to believe another attack was imminent, and he thus cancelled Beresford-Peace's orders for the 4th Armoured Brigade to reinforce the 7th so that they could be retained. The combination of the two events caused serious alarm to Cray, who then sent a message to Beresford-Peace, requesting his presence for instruction. Wavell, who was with Beresford-Peace, took command of the operation and boarded a plane to Cray's command post at Halfway House. This message was also intercepted by the Germans, as Rommel later wrote. It sounded suspiciously as though the British commander no longer felt himself capable of handling the situation. It being now obvious that in the present bewildered state the British would not start anything for the time being, I decided to pull the net tight by going on to Halfire. The 5th Light Division and the 15th Panzer Division, attacking from the southwest and northwest respectively, were only 9 miles from Halfire. At 10 o'clock, as the Panzer Divisions pushed eastward, they ran into the remaining Matildas of the 4th Armoured Brigade, joined on the flank by the remaining Kreuzers and artillery of the 7th Armoured Brigade and 7th Support Group. The tanks formed a screen to protect the 22nd Guards Brigade and 11th Indian Infantry Brigade as they retreated toward Halfway House. At 10:45, Messervy contacted Cray over the radio and, speaking Hindustani for security, informed him that he had ordered a retreat of his infantry from Capuzzo and Halfire to begin at 11 o'clock. At noon, Wavell and Beresford Peace arrived at Halfway House and learned of the retreat, to which Wavell then gave his approval. The British armour stalled the panzer advance to half hour until 1600, by which time the 22nd Guards had escaped.